if you can show that everything that you do within your firm comes back to that central point, how will this impact our client, then actually your behaviour drives the adoption of technology as opposed to technology trying to change behaviour.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it's a bit of a false economy that you can just put a Band-Aid over client experience. It can support the delivery of experience for a client, but if the firm hasn't got a culture of service delivery at a high standard in the first place, then I'm not sure that it's going to help. I think it comes down to the market's competitive, and the way I position it, irrespective of whether you're a small firm or a large firm, the market's particularly competitive. The person that does what you do is potentially in the office next door or upstairs or downstairs. Like if you're on Eagle Street, you probably can't move but walk into a lawyer. You can throw a stone and he'll fall.
Yeah.
So if you consider then that there is the number of people who can do what you do, how is it that you differentiate yourself? How is it that you can have cut through with the clients that you serve, that they will want to come back? And the buyer behaviour you spoke about before, about changes to the way, buyer behaviour is changing. Clients are becoming more discerning. They're looking at, hey, I can have 4 service providers and use the person I want on each of those service lines and not worry about, just using my one legal provider. So I don't think there is a point where you can get away with the way that things were operating 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think consistent evolution. So in terms of dealing with the clients that I've worked with and the firms that I've worked in, particularly on CX projects, it has been around what's our baseline, what's the minimum standard, well, let's up it. So let's, iterate by 5%. And it was focusing on seeking feedback and incrementally looking at service delivery, and then looking at key clients. How are we managing and loving those? How are we doing specific work with them to understand their needs that are different?
Yeah.
So it would be, again, I have to say, it's not something any firm I think can implement in one hit. It's client specific, or it's journey specific, particular part of the journey to iterate and improve.
Yeah.
So I've definitely seen it as a evolution, and I think it's something we have to be cognizant of, that firms will adapt slowly.
Yeah, it's going to be a final product, right?
No. Yeah.
It's going to continually evolve. Like at the point you think you're done, then you're probably kidding yourself. We try and implement things around, like recruitment, for example, at Sky is all about people with legal expertise, whether that's by virtue of their qualification, like me, or by virtue of their experience in the industry, because they understand the client that we're dealing with and what motivates them, the challenges that they're facing, versus someone with general technical expertise who can probably do the work. They don't quite understand or will take time. And look, we do hire people like that because they're a necessary part of the skill set that we need. But that sits within a broader group of people who understand the context of what we do. In the past, we've had clients come in and have interviews on retreats, sort of giving that context, practically telling the team why it is that they use us, why they value our service, which I think for some helps to hammer home the value that you inevitably bring, because people sometimes can have the tendency just to look at their role as particularly in big firms, like a cog in the wheel, and who am I to who's out there? I'm just doing my bit. And they don't get to see necessarily what their bit makes up of as a larger part, and then further what that larger part does for their client externally.
Yeah.
So I think the feedback loop is two-way, in the sense that it's good and, not only what you can improve on, but what you're doing well. And I think if you can focus on that to some extent, people like to deliver good outcomes for other people. So if they can tangibly see what that outcome is, then, perhaps that's going to give them the motivation to consider that outcome when they next undertake, a service-orientated task.
Yeah, and look, it's funny, having a few services businesses, sometimes you're just focusing on delivery, and it really does take that opportunity to step back and try to have that much higher view of, well, what does it mean to actually have a reputation as a great service provider. Not just great service provider, but a great experience provider. And I spoke to a few friends at a recent event, and I asked them who really nails client experience. And literally 3 out of 4 said the same person. And they were just random. And this is a certain business. And I thought, wow, like the strength of that. But she goes so far beyond. And I wonder, what, I always think about that. It's like, oh, how do we then aspire to that? Because a lot of the time as a business owner, just got your head down, you want to be better at your craft, you want to be better at what you do, but how does that translate into the experience the client has? I know for us, process and project management has been a massive part.
Yeah.
So we've implemented a project management platform for clients, essentially, through Notion. And I guess it boils down to, it's communication at the end of the day. For us, like where do we fall down? It's communication. So then how do you improve communication? You put better systems in place. And, friends will laugh at me talking about systems because I've always fought it. But actually, that's the way that you can improve communication and client experience. For law firms, what systems can they put in place to actually make sure that this client experience is improved?
And you can't,
technology or other.
Look, I mean, you can't manage it. You can't manage it if you can't measure it, right? So I think firstly it has to be some sort of feedback program, and that can be multifaceted. We're implementing a feedback program for a large accounting firm at the moment, and that's focused on 2 phases. So one, key client, so seeking a large-scale surveyed feedback and then using that in a really considered way for relationship meetings. And then secondly is post-matter. So that's a 12-month program to get that up running and have data to assess and then make tangible business results.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a process, but underlying that is policies, all sorts of things to understand, articulate, present, and work with partners on. So it's not it's quite considerable. That's just one layer. In terms of the way you manage matters, I mean, you're probably a better place to talk about that. I mean, practice management systems, those types of things that help with bring-ups. Lawyers will use bring-ups for, all sorts of really, must do this by this deadline. Or do they do must-do communication check-in? So part of it's process and behaviour-driven. It's not necessarily technology-driven. Have I communicated with the client? You actually see between B2B and B2C clients, there's just distinct difference.
Yeah.
If it's a B2C client and it's their personal matter, they want increased communication. They want to know where you're at, what's happening. And if you're on an estate matter and nothing's happened with a probate for, several weeks, tell them. It's that, it's behavior change. Unless you use a technology tool to support bring ups to say, hey, contact Mrs. Jones about probate matter, whatever. It's actually behavior. It's having what have I done for my client on this?
Yeah.
Obviously, practice management. There's amazing tools out there that help manage interface with clients. But if I'm honest with you, it has to come. Do I think that any process, any tool will solve a problem where there isn't a service culture?
Yeah.
No, it's just putting a Band-Aid over it.
Well, you can always ignore.
Yeah.
That reminder.
But if it's inherent that you have firm values and beliefs and your mission is all about serving this client and we are proactive, and what does that mean from a behaviour perspective that supports our client, that we are transparent? Well, what does that mean? We communicate on bills. And if that's drilled in and that's part of your recruitment process and part of your evaluation performance, part of how you look at every single tool that you implement, is that going to help with our mission? How does that impact our values? How does that impact our behaviours? If you can show that everything that you do within your firm comes back to that central point, how will this impact our client?
Yeah.
Then actually your behaviour drives the adoption of technology as opposed to technology trying to change behaviour.
Yeah.
So in my opinion, it's a bit of a false economy that you can just put a Band-Aid over client experience. It can support the delivery of experience for a client, but if the firm hasn't got a culture of service, delivery, at a high standard in the first place, and I'm not sure that it's going to help.
Yeah.
Look, I think transparency is a big thing, and you can do that informally or through a tool. But like Kim said, I think the culture around being proactively transparent, particularly in our space, like working on big matters with competing deadlines and multiple tasks. I think historically we built a custom project management tool that is immensely helpful internally for managing that. And the end goal for us is obviously to make elements of that externally visible, so that instead of having to email an update, the client might be able to log in to their project and be like, hey, that's where it's at. I don't need to ring that and be like, hey, where's it at?
Yeah.
And for me to miss that call and then call back 2 hours later because I'm in a workshop being like, hey, I'll just call the person that's running that project and come back to you. And then it's like 3 hours have passed, 4 people are now involved. And instead, if you had sort of, and look, full transparency is probably a really bad thing, because like shit hits the fan regularly, and like stuff happens whereby it's never, we're all ducks cruising along on the surface looking real cool, but meanwhile the legs underneath are going 1,000,000 miles an hour. So full transparency, horrible idea, but some transparency.
Managed transparency.
And it comes down to communication, and I think we all, now as we move further into the digital world, which has been accelerated as a result of COVID, and we're going to have a whole lot of digital natives rolling on board, that like picking up the phone's not necessarily going to be their preferred method of communication, or sending an email. And like, there are clients that communicate now with Teams and Slack and all of that sort of stuff. It's not a text, like it's text messages. Back in my day, like doing that, in my day, like I'm 80 years old. I've lived 1,000 years. But things like, it would be all email correspondence or the telephone. Whereas now we have clients on, for better or worse, Teams groups where like they can message instantaneously and be like, hey, where's that at? What's happening here?
But it's interesting about the natives, like the technology natives, whatever you call them, it's a very cool term. But anyway, the young people who grow up with this, right? They also don't have necessarily the life skill to understand that, hey, my client's a parent of 4 children. I should not be sending them or trying to engage with them around 11 to 1 because she'll be dealing with, or he'll be dealing with, or actually I know they're all in lockdown, I shouldn't do it around here. It's having that awareness and cognizance of the client and the client's needs. And technology, I think, is a blessing and a curse in some senses, because we also, and again, maybe it's the natives, but they rely so heavily on the technology, they lose the human element. And actually, from an experience perspective, it is around human connectivity. And that's another thing that COVID has shown us, that if clients can't get into the office, they can't sit across the board table and have to pay expensive parking, and nobody gives a shit. They don't care if they can't come into the office as long as they can get in touch with you, but they also want human connectivity. And I think there is a bit of a default within the industry that it can be all process driven, that eliminates some of that human connectedness, which actually proves the rapport. It's the commonality. It's the someone calling you, say, I'm Karen, I'm your wine rep. Exactly. You've got one. I had my lady from England calling about my experience, but it wasn't as cool as a wine rep. But it's that human connection as well. I just think there's got to be an element where we have that is baked in, that's important. And a little old lady, and a lot of law firms, smaller law firms, are still B2C. And those people are, old people who haven't got, lower socioeconomic, they don't have access to all the technology and tools that we expect.
Well, look, funnily enough, like we service law firms and lawyers, in-house lawyers and in government as well, and they might look like B2B on the outside, but it's definitely leaning more towards a B2C sort of relationship, in the sense that a lot of them operate in silos or in teams or packs that operate under larger brands or overreaching policies, but tend to operate more like a consumer, where their preferences are unique and individual. And I think one of the fundamental starting points for CX, at least for me, is defining, if we're talking about attraction, defining who the clients are that you want to attract and speaking to them. And if it's about retention and engagement with current clients, you need to understand them, profile them, and then test that profile, seek that feedback, whether directly or indirectly. Is this you? Like, could we be doing better? And build those profiles and mold your experience to suit them. Because we have a myriad of clients that we work with, some that probably work in an office next to one another and will operate very differently in terms of how they might want to be communicated with, and serviced on their projects. And it's all about understanding that and also retaining that information, not keeping it just in my head because I manage that project, and then, you know, Tom rolls along and he gets blindsided because he, you know, goes to approach it a bit more traditionally. So that knowledge sharing element around customer profiles and their preferences is also particularly important.